Welcome to the Region Free Gamers Podcast, Episode 7. And for this episode, the simians are back. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Region Free Gamers Podcast, the podcast that is fluent in gaming. We're available on iTunes and all other good podcasting services, so if you like what you're hearing, please make sure to leave us a review on iTunes and subscribe. It really does make a difference, and as we're growing, it really does mean something for more people to subscribe and put the word out about our podcast. And with that out of the way, let us introduce the other Region Free Gamers that are joining us for this fine episode. To the far east, we have the man from Finland, Masa.
Hey yo.
And close to the US capital, we have our man, Arnaldo.
Hey, what's going on, guys?
And today we are excited because we're talking about the Donkey Kong Country series, which was one of the most beloved series of the 1990s. And as usual, before we delve into that, though, we want to talk about what we have been playing lately. So, Masa, what have you been playing lately?
Okay, so I think during the last episode, I promised that this time I wouldn't talk about Yakuza, since I had just finished Yakuza 6. But of course, that's not gonna happen.
Promises are made to be broken.
I even I left I think Paul made a post about Trails of Cold Steel, and then he mentioned Yakuza. We always talk about Yakuza, and I was like, yeah, if we really wanted to make we could already make a clip show about Yakuza, and it would make for a full-length podcast episode.
I really do think so. I really do think that we could have a full-length episode on Yakuza. I think we must have dedicated at least an hour to Yakuza. Yeah.
But this time I'm gonna keep the Yakuza part really short because just recently Sega announced that they will be releasing Yakuza 3, 4 and 5 remastered versions of those for the PS4. So that's why I felt maybe I should revisit Yakuza 3 and 4. And I've been playing both games for a few hours, although I did decide quite early on that when it comes to Yakuza 3, I'm gonna wait for the remastered version. Of course, at this point we don't know if they are actually going to be released in the West. I'm hoping that they will localize those. Of course, the problem with Yakuza 3 compared to 4 and 5 is that the original translation is not very good, and there was a lot of cut content. So that's one game that they need to localize again.
I'm wondering whether they're going to reinsert that content, because that would mean they would have to add translation to that content, and I don't think that Sega would do that. And with respect to that, I think I read last week that Yakuza 6 actually sold well in the West, and that's very encouraging because it really does seem like the Yakuza series is gaining a lot of traction. So it really bodes well for a Yakuza future in the West, and probably this ports Yakuza 3, 4, and 5 coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yakuza 0 was basically the first Yakuza game that actually did fairly well in the West, and then they released Kiwami. I'm not sure how well Kiwami did, but yeah, Yakuza 6 has been actually I've been checking out the sales data for different countries, and it has shown up in the top selling games lists, and there's been reports that it's actually the best-selling Yakuza game in the West, or at least it's about to become the best-selling Yakuza game in the West.
Well, that's good to hear, because later this year we're getting Kiwami 2. So we have 2 Yakuza games a year in the West, which that's... if you had told me this maybe 5 years ago, because I've been keeping track of the Yakuza series for a long time, and it was always a struggle because we knew that if something was announced in Japan, it was very unlikely that it was going to come over here, or at least it was going to be 2-3 years of waiting in order to have that announced. So the fact that we're getting Yakuza 6 this year and Yakuza Kiwami 2, and last year we got Yakuza 0 earlier in the year and then Yakuza Kiwami, that's a really fantastic state of being right now for a Yakuza fan.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think that part of it, and this will be, I guess, my first controversial statement of the podcast.
Oh boy!
But I think I talked to you guys a little bit about it. Is that I think at this point, if not yet, Yakuza is poised to be Sega's new marquee franchise. I think that Sonic is going to take a back seat to Kazuma Kiryu for a little bit.
I think that could be a little bit difficult because Yakuza is an M-rated series, and I think Kiryu already has that standing as a mascot of sort. But it's a little bit difficult because the Japanese do like to have their kid-friendly mascots. I think there's still a perception in Japan that games are for kids. So go ahead.
And I'm not trying to say that that Yakuza is gonna sort of overthrow Sonic or be the new gaming franchise that Sega focuses on, but it's clear that this franchise right now is doing a lot better than any of their other franchise, specifically in the West. So I think a lot of people in the next few years, especially if they keep pushing Yakuza this way and keep putting out new games and remasters and re-releases, I think Yakuza is going to become much more recognizable as a Sega property than it is right now.
Which I don't know why the thought has come to my mind right now. Why has Sega not given Kiryu a Sonic costume as downloadable content? I think that's a missed opportunity right there. So
I think there needs to be Sonic Forces DLC of Kiryu's outfit.
Do you imagine Kiryu dressed as Tails? Do you imagine Kiryu dressed as Tails? That would be so awesome.
But yeah, I would say it's actually like really important that because the sales of the Yakuza franchise have been going down in Japan for the last few releases. And for example, the Feast of North Star spin-off game, like that didn't, hit their expectations at all. It actually like fell really short of the expectations. So that's why it's, I would say, I wouldn't be surprised if, I mean, it's already happening that Sega has started like pushing the series more in the West because they need those sales. Because
I was going to say, do you think that's the reason they're sort of putting out all these new games out here is because sales have dipped over in Japan?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think so, yeah.
I mean, they've announced that before they actually released the game. I mean, at least the last few games has been like that. So I don't necessarily think it's tied to sales, but I do think they want to have more of a marketing push into the West in order to supplant those potential lost customers in Japan. And that's really unfortunate because I looked at the Fist of the North Star game and it looked actually really good. And I would love for that game to be translated and localized here. But I think it's unlikely that that's going to happen unless Sega wants to make back the cost.
Sega actually, like, they had a survey like when Yakuza 6 came out, and they mentioned that game, and there was a question like, yeah, would you be interested if this game was localized? And what's interesting about this is that they actually took that question down only, like, I think it was a few days after the release, and they tweeted that, yeah, we have enough answers regarding this question. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but yeah.
Well, I really do hope, though, one of the things that I've really lamented about the Yakuza series is the fact that the historical epics never came out here, Kensan and Ishin, and I think it's very unlikely that those are going to ever be translated into the US because they're probably so tied to idiosyncratic folklore that it would be very difficult to localize that. But I really would love for the Kensan and Ishin entries to be localized here in the US, but I just don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, I think the series producer even mentioned that like those games aren't getting localized, that they are they actually mentioned that exact reason that they are like, okay, so yeah, the Yakuza series is very Japanese, but it's not like a historical series, so that's like the main reason why they aren't coming out here. But yeah, like I still like, I don't know, like, do you guys still have something to say about Yakuza? Because there's still like one game that I want to talk about before.
All right, no. Go ahead.
Okay, because I mean, I don't want this segment to turn into like like a Yakuza segment every fucking time.
It's a recurring segment.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's gonna be like Masa's Yakuza corner or something soon. But yeah, like the game that I've been playing the most, because I mean, ever since I finished Yakuza 6, I've been, I don't know, I feel like I've probably played like 10 different games since then. All of these games only for a few hours. Like I played Super Mario RPG, Secret of Mana, The Witcher 3, a bunch of other games. But the game that I've been playing the most is actually Gravity Rush Remastered. Have you guys played Gravity Rush?
I
I
have,
have not.
I have, and I played it on the Vita back when it came out, and I was really, really amazed and enthralled by the art style. It's a very it's a mixture of Japanese animation and French bande dessinée, like comic book art, like comic strip art, and it's a beautiful, beautiful art style, and the design of cat and the like, and the very French aesthetic. It's really appealing to me. I don't know if I could honestly say I liked the game. I was very interested in it, but I thought the game was a little bit repetitive, and the movement itself, because of the gravity mechanic, was very disorienting. So I don't know if I just did not, did not really get into it, and so I stopped playing it around 5 hours after starting. So I love the art style. It didn't hook me.
Yeah, I would say I actually tried out the game. I think a few years ago or a couple of years ago on the Vita because there was the demo, and I was like, yeah, the idea is really cool, but I couldn't get into it. But like, I finally started playing the remastered version, and I feel like it's a lot better. Especially like the camera is improved, and I feel like the controls are a bit tighter this time around.
Well, good to
Um,
hear. I mean,
yeah,
the other part about the remaster version is that it's become really expensive in physical form. So at least in the West. So
actually, yeah, regarding that, a collector's tip. The PAL version is actually quite cheap. You can get a brand new copy for like, 20, 30 euros. But the US version is expensive because it was a Amazon exclusive.
Oh, yes, yes. Okay, so I think I may get it on PAL because I like my physical games.
But yeah, I mean, I'm enjoying the game a lot. I mean, it's definitely not perfect, but it's so unique. It's like I don't think I've ever played anything like it before, and I like the feeling that I've been getting while playing the game. I've been like, I really wish that like Sony would actually push more games like this, and I mean, and develop more games like this. Cause
Well, I mean, I commend Sony for even financing games like this.
yeah, exactly.
I bought the sequel just because I wanted to support games like this, not necessarily because I was very interested in it. But the fact that Sony and Team Japan is actually even making games like this. I remember there was this period during the late 2000s when the PSP was still in business that Sony was just coming out with just this weird games like Echo Chrome and Loco Roco and Patapon. And it was just so amazing that they were just doing this very interesting, quirky games. And I think they still are. I think even, compared to like Microsoft, which very rarely does an out there game, and I think they're trying to correct that. Sony really puts their backs behind this really quirky ideas. The problem with Sony that I've always found is that once it's financed and once it's done, they don't advertise it. So you don't have any type of way of knowing that these games exist.
And I would say about Gravity Rush, like yesterday I was playing the game and I got this weird feeling that it's a very Nintendo-like game
It
because
really
it's
is.
yeah, because it's okay. So of course, if it was developed by Nintendo, I know that it would be more polished. But yeah, here it really feels like because Nintendo is always okay. So yeah, Gravity Rush does have a story, but I feel like it's still more of a game where it's like gameplay first, and then like the story and the animated cutscenes and that kind of stuff. And like yeah, I mean it's really unique and creative. Of course, like yeah, the controls could be a bit better and but yeah, I feel like the skill ceiling in that game is very high. Like that's one game that I've been playing. I'm not very good at it yet, but like I've been thinking about that. Yeah, I really wanna go on YouTube and watch like some like legit good players play it because I feel like you can do like some really amazing things in that game.
Well, I still have to play the sequel. It's still in my backlog, the very very long monstrous backlog. So I still have to play it. But Artie, what have you been playing?
Uh, I've been playing a lot actually. Once I finished Yakuza Kiwami, I started Parasite Eve, which I'm 2 or 3 hours into it at this point, and I am enjoying it. But I think the main thing I've probably been playing since I've been traveling a little bit is Professor Layton and Phoenix Wright on the 3DS, and that's been really enjoyable. It's my first Phoenix Wright game, and I think my third or fourth Professor Layton game. And I really like those games just because they're so easy to pick up, futz around for a couple hours, do some puzzles, and then just put down. They don't demand very long stretches of playtime. So that's been what I've been playing the most recently.
Well, I haven't played a Professor Layton game. I know they're developed by Level 5, which is the guys that make Ni no Kuni and the Dark Cloud series. But they seem to have a huge fan following, and they seem to sell very well, and they seem to be very well made tight games. But they're already maybe 6 or 7 entries in the series.
At least.
Yeah,
and let me ask you,
a lot of games.
Let me ask you, is this more of a Professor Layton game or more of a Phoenix Wright game?
At least insofar as I've played, and I haven't gotten very far yet, I think it's more of a Professor Layton game. It sort of divides itself in the beginning as you do one Professor Layton section, one Phoenix Wright section, I think, to just give you the basics of each in case you haven't played one or the other or either. And then they sort of come together story-wise. But I have not gotten to the point to see if there's any interaction between both styles of gameplay or if they still keep them separate throughout the story. But it's mostly been Professor Layton as far as I've played.
Yeah, I gotta say, I have played one of the Layton games on the 3DS. I don't remember the name. And then I've played...
If it was on the 3DS, it's probably like a Miracle Mask or Azran Legacy or something like that.
Yeah, and I did try one of the Phoenix Wright games, but these are definitely two franchises that I'm not super familiar with. But at least the little that I played, it's kind of difficult for me to imagine them combining both gameplay styles.
Yeah. I mean, I love the Phoenix Wright games. I played through the first one, and they're really, really funny games actually. And it's just kind of the interactions between the defense and the prosecution. It's really, and plus they have great music. So it's interesting to kind of see those two franchises mashed together. But let me ask you, Arnie, do they have animation in the Professor Layton games? Are there anime cutscenes?
So there are. They're interspersed throughout the games. So they're not, every cutscene is not an anime cutscene. But there are a few of them. It just depends. I think it's mostly for major set pieces and important plot points and stuff like that. You get a little anime video, maybe a couple minutes in length. But most of the game is voice acted, even the still parts.
So what type of puzzles usually? I mean, is it kind of logic puzzles or the like? Or because I have very little experience. I have almost no experience with the Professor Layton games.
Yeah, so each game it's just a big variety of puzzles. There's usually, I want to say, at least 200 puzzles in every single game I've played, usually more than that. And they run the gamut. Some of them are simple, moving blocks. Some of them are, sort of riddles. Some of them are math problems. Some of them are geometry oriented. There's a whole bunch of stuff. You'll see sort of similar puzzles. As you play more games, you'll see puzzles that are similar but set up in different ways. So playing through one Layton game sort of gives you an idea of what to expect in other games, but there's always new puzzles that are different. It just depends on what you like. I like that there's a big variety of stuff, and they are legitimately difficult puzzles. The sort of difficulty scale ramps up pretty evenly for the most part, as in once you're towards the end of the game, you're seeing a lot more difficult puzzles, but there's a hint system to help you out and stuff like that. I've gotten stuck on a million puzzles. One good thing that I do like is that there's enough puzzles where the requirements for advancing the story in a lot of cases is a certain number of puzzles to be completed. But in any given area, you're given enough puzzles to where you can skip a good amount of puzzles and still be able to progress the story. So I don't think it's not set up in such a way where you have to be able to pass every single puzzle to be able to continue. I've always been a puzzle person. Like, I like puzzle games, specifically like logic and brain teasers. So it's always been really fun for me. And they integrate, the touch screen into some of them and stuff like that. So they keep it pretty fresh from game to game, considering there's been 5, 6, 7 games at this point.
And do you feel like you're actually engaging your mind when you're playing these games?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, some of the puzzles are simple, but a lot of these puzzles are legitimately difficult. Like, if you don't have an understanding of how a puzzle sort of comes together, some of these are incredibly hard to solve, and some of them are set up in a way where you can't just guess at an answer until you sort of figure it out. Because some of these have so many different possible solutions that you have to sort of know kind of what the puzzle wants you to do in order to have a chance of figuring it out. Some of them are multiple choice where they give you a number of answers, and so those you can sort of take a stab at over and over again until you figure them out. There is penalties for sort of trying to guess at puzzles and like getting things wrong, because the way it's set up, it's basically each puzzle is worth a number of points, and every time you fail a puzzle, when you retry it, you get less points for completing it. But the points aren't anything that's like in-game related. It's for extra content. So it doesn't punish you by taking away anything that'll make the game more difficult. But it rewards you for being good at the puzzles by getting more points, which allows you to unlock more extra stuff at the end.
Good. I do have to try the games. I really do feel like it's a blind spot for me, so I do have to try the games. And because of the 3DS and the DS, as you said, they're really good games to pick up and play and just keep in your pocket. And you can just pop it out on the subway or on a trip or the like. So I really do have to try them. So
yeah, I almost exclusively play them when I'm traveling. I don't really play them when I'm at home and I can play other stuff. But when I'm going on a plane or a train or anything like that where I'm going to be away from most of my games, I usually take one of them, and that's usually when I've finished them, is when I get a lot of time to sort of go through them. But this one I was excited for because I'd never played a Phoenix Wright game, and I've always wanted to because they seem really fun and quirky, and the gameplay is sort of unique to that franchise. So I was really interested in it, and the little I've played of the Phoenix Wright segments, I really enjoyed.
No, you have to try the Phoenix Wright games. They're really, really good. But with that said, I'm going to talk about what I have been playing lately, and I've been mixing it up. I've been, as you guys probably know, there are sales all the time for games, so you end up just buying a bunch of games on a whim that you never end up playing. You put one in, and then you try them, and then you try another one, and sometimes it's very hard to really get invested in one game or really fall head deep into one game. But the one that I actually have been playing lately, and it's more because it's on the Switch, and anything that's on the Switch I love, and I will probably give preference to, and that's Wonder Boy: The Dragon's Trap. And this is a remake of a Sega Master System game that came out in, I think, 1989, and it was made by this French studio that was in love with the original game. And this is a game that a bunch of people love. When they were growing up, it was a beloved entry, and they've done a fantastic job of remaking this game to the point that I really want almost every remake of a classic retro game to have everything that this game has, because you can change from a modern look to a retro look on a whim, and you can mix and match between soundtrack, the old soundtrack and the new graphics, or the old graphics and the new soundtrack, and the gameplay is still one-to-one. It's still the same gameplay as was the case in the Master System. And the fact that you're allowed to go into the retro look really allows you to see that it's still the same gameplay. And so it's kind of a testament to gameplay being king. Gameplay mattering above all. The fact that this 30-year-old game at this point is still playable, still enjoyable, and the only thing it needed was a fresh coat of paint. So have you guys played this game?
No, I haven't. And I gotta say it's a bit sad that our resident Master System fanboy Paul isn't here to talk about this.
That's the
But
big elephant in the room.
yeah, but I gotta say, Wonder Boy has been on my radar, and I'm definitely gonna pick it up at some point. And I believe that, yeah, I mean, there's a physical release, and yeah, I think I'm probably gonna pick it up at some point. I've never actually played the original game, so, but I really love the animation style, like the new, like updated look of that game. So yeah, I'm definitely gonna check it out.
Well, it's interesting because there's this weird the Wonder Boy series has a very tortured history, which many people in other mediums and other good podcasts have gone into, because there was this weird licensing agreement that the creator had with Sega, so that Sega owned the franchise, but the creator owned the characters or something along those lines. So out of the Wonder Boy series came out the Adventure Island series, and there were all these different games that were part of the Wonder Boy series, but they didn't follow any chronological order or the like, or you couldn't really tell that, which one came first. So it's a very tortured history, but it's interesting that now there are two basically new entries in the Wonder Boy series. One is Wonder Boy the Dragon's Trap, which is the remake of Wonder Boy 3. And another one is Monster Boy, and the Cursed Kingdom, and that one is hasn't been released yet, but it's also being done by a French studio. So it's interesting that with the tortured history of Wonder Boy, that we also have two studios that are basically coming out with the same kind of game, even though they had no awareness of each other or the fact that they were working on a game like this. But I will say, I mean, it's a perfect example of how to do a remake right. The animation is probably the best animation I have seen in a video game, to be honest. At least a 2D video game. I really want every 2D video game to be like this. If they could remake, like, for example, the old Castlevanias or even the old Mega Mans. I mean, I know this is sacrilege, so people are gonna like go up in arms if I say that the old Mega Mans should be remade. But if they could remake it in a way that you could just switch back and forth from the old look to the new look, I mean, I would buy every single game that came out like that, because it's really just very well done, and the soundtrack goes from this bleeps and bloops of the Master System to this fully orchestrated soundtrack that's influenced by like tango, by calypso music, by classical music. It's just a beautiful rendition of this old game. So it's a kind of a visionary reimagining of this old game. So I can't stress it enough. Arnie, have you played it?
I have not. This was the one that originally came out as a limited run release, right?
Correct.
It was a PS4 via, and then they just recently did a general Switch release.
Correct.
Okay. I remember seeing previews for this before it hit limited run via YouTube and stuff. And that feature of the button changing just does a pan over and changes the graphics from 8-bit to the more modern look. That was amazing to me. I thought that should be a standard feature of any like retro re-release. Honestly, the fact that the Mega Man Legacy collections don't have that is appalling to me. Just because I think it gives people more options. I think it really does show off. Sort of, it puts in people's minds the hard work that sort of goes into it, right? Because you can see, what this game used to look like, and then with a push of a button, just sort of change it back to what it looks like now. And it really does give you a new appreciation for graphics and video game just art, just the work and the effort that's put into making these games look this good on these systems.
Well,
I haven't played it, but it's definitely one that I want to play.
You've hit the nail on the head, which is that it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, so that's why people don't do it. I mean, I remember that the Halo Master Chief Collection actually had that, and it's funny because when you have that, it's almost kind of like a tick that develops where you're constantly changing back and forth, constantly changing, and it's like, this is how it used to look, now this is how it looks, before, after. So it's a really fun feature to play with, but it does take a lot of effort to implement something like that, because once you remake a game, you can't really translate everything. The hitboxes change, the way that characters interact with each other change. All of those things are not one-to-one when you take a game that was done in 1987 or 1988 and you adapt it to a modern setting. So it's just too much work, and it has to be a labor of love, as is the case with Wonder Boy the Dragon's Trap, that really, is able to pull something like this off. Because if you ask a big publisher whether they're willing to support something like this, they'll say, why? What's the point? Just remake it and put a fresh coat of paint into it. Make it in Unity or something. Something that's cheap and we can just put out there and sell it for $20. So it's unfortunate, but I really do appreciate the fact that there are developers out there that really are putting their backs into presenting something that's old in a fresh and new way. And I really commend the developers. I think it's Lizard Cube, that's her name. And it's a great little game. I actually really have been enjoying it, even though it's hard as hell. It's just 8-bit hard. I mean, I've been dying over and over and over again, and it's one of those games where if you die, you go back to the very beginning. You don't get level checkpoints or anything like that.
Yeah, no regenerating health for you.
No, nothing at all. And but it's interesting that a lot of what the game did back in 1989 are staples right now of the Metroidvania genre. They really have a fully open world that opens up as you gain more power-ups. So the whole world is available to you from the beginning, but you just can't access certain areas until you obtain a power-up. And it's really amazing that this was before Super Metroid. This was before Symphony of the Night. I mean, it was after the original Metroid, but I don't even think the original Metroid was able to pull that off as well as Wonder Boy does. So I think it's a great little game, honestly. I really have been having a great time playing through it.
But yeah, I gotta say, one of my all-time dream games would be, I really would love to see Nintendo do something like that with the Super Mario games. Because, of course, we have the new Super Mario Bros. Series, and gameplay-wise, and when it comes to level design, those games are good. I gotta say, they are actually some of the better Mario games, 2D Mario games. But to be honest, I'm not a big fan of the graphical look of those games. So what I really would love to see, imagine Wonder Boy style remakes of Mario 3 and Super Mario World. That would be amazing. That's what I want to see, a 2D Mario game with the more cartoony look.
All right, I think I have to address this because even though this is going to be a digression and we might end up just spending too much time on this, I don't think there's anyone out there that likes the look of New Super Mario Brothers, of the new Super Mario Brothers. It's an absolutely awful, horrid look, and I don't know why Nintendo doesn't have graphics, hand-drawn graphics. If you look at the old Mario games and you look at Super Mario World, that pixel art was kind of the equivalent of hand-drawn animation. So it doesn't necessarily translate well to CG animation, and very low-quality CG animation, very bland, very unvarnished in a way. So I don't know why Nintendo has not done, hand-drawn graphics, hand-drawn look, that cel-shaded look at the very least. If you look at Wario Land Shake It, that game looks amazing. And that's how I want every new 2D Mario game to look. Did you play that, Masa?
I actually haven't played it. I haven't played any of the more recent Wario platformers.
Yeah, I mean, but I'm glad that this new Super Mario Brothers series has kind of died, because I really hate that they kept using this terrible art style. I almost refuse to play them based on that. I really do think that, and I think honestly that's why I loved Odyssey so much, because I felt like it was a return to form in terms of the aesthetics of Mario. I really do feel like there was very whimsical new characters. For a long time, Mario just had the same characters over and over and over again, and the same settings, and it just got very old. And that's why I loved Odyssey, because it presented all these new environments and this brand new intrepid aesthetic look. And I really hope that translates into new 2D entries, which I don't know if Nintendo is working on any 2D entries right now for Mario, but if I'm Nintendo, there's absolutely no reason why I wouldn't be doing a 2D Mario right now.
Yeah, if you think about like we have gotten 4 new Super Mario Brothers titles so far, and it's annoying how okay, so the first one on the DS, I was like, yeah, this looks cool, and I mean it's a nice looking DS game, but then I played the fourth one on the Wii U, and I was like, oh my god, it's the same style again. And if you think about like the old like the first 4 Mario games, or let's say like the first 5, they all have a very different graphical style. Like even like the NES trilogy, and then like Super Mario World, and then like Super Mario World 2. Okay, so yeah, sure, it's more of a Yoshi game, but still it looks completely different compared to Super Mario World. And I really hope that the next Mario game, and I'm sure that they will keep releasing 2D Mario games because historically those have always sold better than the 3D entries. So, but yeah, I'm really hoping that there's gonna be like something different and that they will ditch the new Super Mario Brothers look.
You know what gives me a little bit of inspiration? The fact that Super Mario Maker included the various looks for Mario when designing levels. And I really think, something like Wonder Boy could work very easily for Mario because if you recall, Super Mario All-Stars for the SNES updated the graphical look of the original Mario games. So, but I think it was the same kind of gameplay. It was the same hitboxes and everything. So I think they could just do something like that and translate with the All-Stars look, and also the old Nintendo look. So I think if Nintendo does that, I mean, I think they'd have a lot of goodwill.
Now that we mentioned that, I bet that what we are gonna get is gonna be like a new Super Mario Brothers All Stars collection.
It's probably gonna be the case. Probably, yeah. Knowing Nintendo, that's probably gonna be the case.
Yeah, exactly.
That we are ready for our main event, and what we are talking about today is Donkey Kong Country, that old simian that's been a staple of gaming history since the very early days of games. So before we get into that, I want to ask you guys, what comes to mind? What do you think of when you think Donkey Kong?
Donkey Kong Country.
Masa?
I gotta say, the first...
Exclusively.
I gotta say, I'm a bit different. Like when you mention Donkey Kong, the first thing that comes to my mind is the original arcade game.
And it's kind of weird because for an entire generation, you mentioned Donkey Kong, and the arcade game is really all they knew because it was such a huge sensation. But for people my age and Arnie's age, Donkey Kong Country really is what you envision.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting how Donkey Kong Country has become kind of a replacement for the old Donkey Kong. And, some people will lament it. Some people will say that's not the real Donkey Kong. But it's interesting that this whole new redesign by this British developers just slowly supplanted the old Donkey Kong.
Well, and I'd like to say, in fairness, the original arcade, though it had the name Donkey Kong was not the focus of that game. Donkey Kong was not the star of that game. Donkey Kong Country, maybe some of the NES ports, because I think they did Donkey Kong Jr. and wasn't there a Donkey Kong 3 in arcades as well?
Yes, there was a Donkey Kong Jr., Donkey Kong 3, and I think for those you played as Donkey Kong Jr.
Yeah, and so who technically I guess is the Donkey Kong in Donkey Kong Country. So maybe this is a moot point.
Yes.
But Donkey Kong Country was was the first game where Donkey Kong was front and center protagonist. Sort of the story was about him. You got to learn more about the world that Donkey Kong lives in, the people he's surrounded by. So I think Donkey Kong Country was at least the first game that really fleshed out the character of Donkey Kong.
And he was the good guy, which made the difference. I mean, in the old games, he was the bad guy, and you had the very imposing music, da, 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 So it's different when you're playing as a good guy, and all you want is to recover your hoard of bananas that's been stolen by these crocodiles. So really, when you think about it, that's really the story. So I really, I mean, in my case, I really do think of Donkey Kong Country when I think Donkey Kong, and from a gaming history perspective, I always recall the original Donkey Kong, but really when I think Donkey Kong, it has to be the Rareware Donkey Kongs. So I think that for a lot of kids my age, that's really what they think, because there was such a huge marketing push for Donkey Kong Country back in the 90s. So to take a step back for setting up where Donkey Kong Country kind of came to be, we have to go back to Rareware, which was the developer of the Donkey Kong Country games. Rare is one of the most storied developers in gaming, and when they used to be called Ultimate Play the Game, they had a bunch of ZX Spectrum games. They're based in the UK, and they were founded by Chris and Tim Stamper, two brothers that were kind of this technical wizards that were really able to work with a lot of the technology at the time and do amazing things with it. Rare has been very closely identified with Nintendo. They've had a close working relationship with them since the late 1980s. And according to the lore, the way that they became involved with Nintendo was that Nintendo said that no one could reverse engineer the NES and the Famicom, and Rare did it. And they also showed off some technical demos to Nintendo, and so because of that, Nintendo was so impressed that they started commissioning a bunch of games for Nintendo, and Rareware almost became kind of like a sole Nintendo developer after that point. I think it was 1988, 1989. So,
yeah. Wasn't Rare, or I guess aren't Rare the most prolific developers for the NES? Is that not right?
I think so. I think for the NES, certainly. Yeah. I mean, they had like 60 games or something like that, 50, 60 games. It was something ludicrous. From what I hear, they would like pump out games every month.
All those nice isometric exploration games they put out.
Yeah, most of which have not aged very well. So, did you guys have any experience with Rare back in the 80s? I mean, I know, Arnie, you weren't born, but
unfortunately,
but maybe maybe. But Masa, did you have any experience with Rare in the 80s?
Yeah, but it wasn't like, I'm actually like checking out the list of games they developed for the NES, and I'm like, yeah, I actually played a lot of these games, but it wasn't the same as during the Super Nintendo era and of course the N64 era, because like there's a bunch of games like RC Pro-Am, played that, Anticipation, Cobra Triangle,
Snake, Rattle and Roll,
Warriors. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of games. Snake, Rattle and Roll, but I don't think the Rare as a brand was like that strong back then.
Absolutely.
No, it really wasn't.
I mean, maybe amongst gamers, but
and I mean, of course, there's Battletoads. Yeah, I mean that was a big game, of course.
Yeah, I think Battletoads was really where Rare started gaining a name for itself. Because I don't know if you guys know, but Battletoads came out at the height of Ninja Turtles mania, so they were kind of seen as a knockoff of the Ninja Turtles. And so you could probably attribute a lot of the popularity of Battletoads to the fact that everyone loved the Ninja Turtles. And we've talked about this ad nauseum in the Beat 'em Ups episode. If you haven't heard that, please go check that out. It's episode 2. But yeah, I don't think Rare really had a lot of cachet back in the late 80s, early 90s. But, one of the things that surprised me when I was looking into Rare is the fact that they kept developing for the NES until 1993. And they didn't really jump onto the SNES in full until 1994. I mean, they had Battletoads and Double Dragon and Battletoads and Battlemaniacs, and those were on the SNES. But those were the only SNES games that they released up to 1994, which is really surprising.
And Battletoads Double Dragon had an NES port, so
yeah, that's the Battletoads and Battlemaniacs.
Yeah.
So they still very much supported the NES. That was very surprising considering that the SNES had been around for, at that point, 4 years. Yeah. So it's not something that you necessarily see. But Nintendo saw something promising in Rare because they really kept supporting them and they really kept putting their financial backing into them. And by 1994, they acquired a 49% stake in Rareware. And so they became a second-party developer for Nintendo. But at the time, I mean, if you guys recall, 3D graphics were all the rage, and everyone wanted to be the first to do fully model 3D graphics. And I don't know if you recall, but like Lawnmower Man had 3D graphics, or Lawnmower Man, such a great classic of the 1990s. And it wasn't until Toy Story came out in 1995 that there really was a huge hit that was fully 3D modeled. But Rare really wanted to be at the cutting edge of technology, so they invested in silicon graphics image workstations, so SGI workstations, which allowed them to realize full 3D modeling in almost the same vein as what Pixar was doing with Toy Story. And so they started focusing on trying to improve their technology. And it's not a stretch to say that they were probably the most advanced studio in terms of their capabilities that they had at the time in order to fully model 3D graphics. And go ahead.
It wasn't the guys who made Balls 3D for the SNES. They weren't the bleeding edge of technology.
No. Well, maybe they gave him a run for their money. But no, I mean, these workstations actually were worth $80,000 each of them.
Jesus.
So if you count that for inflation, if you take into account inflation, that's probably like $150,000 that these were worth. And they had 3 workstations. So and even then, from what I hear, it took them a full night to render just one single model. To render Donkey Kong, it took them a single night. And when they got to the office, they may not necessarily have finished rendering. So this is when you realize how far we have come in terms of technology. But I've been talking too much. So with that said, this was the setting that Donkey Kong Country first, came to be. So let me ask you guys, Donkey Kong Country released November of 1994. When did you first become aware of Donkey Kong Country?
So for me, it was pretty much I don't remember the year. It was well after release, I'm sure. I had a Super Nintendo, and I think a neighbor or a friend of my grandmother had a son or a grandson who just wasn't interested in playing their Super Nintendo anymore. So I inherited what must have been 20 some odd games at the time, including Donkey Kong Country 1 and 2. And that was the first time I played it. Probably, if I had to guess, it was probably somewhere between 97 and 99, in that sort of range.
And were you impressed by the graphics?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'd never seen anything like that before. Even by the standards of, once I was a little bit older and the N64 had come out and I saw some of the early polygonal stuff, that still looked impressive. That was sort of... I think it was a turning point in my sort of development as a gamer, where I was this is the future. It was sort of this is what we can achieve beyond sort of 16-bit pixel sprite work. It was just, it was something that at the time just seemed so realistic, even though that sounds a little sad now. But when I first saw it, I was like, oh my god, this looks like I'm right there, if I went into the jungle, this is probably what it would look like.
How about you, Masa?
It was actually in 1994, and what is interesting is that Nintendo had already announced that they were working on a new console named Ultra 64. And I remember reading this one Nintendo magazine back in '94, and the magazine even like they were speculating because at that point like the console had been announced and we got like the first screenshots of Donkey Kong Country. They were like, yeah, could Donkey Kong Country be like the first game for Ultra 64? And I was like, oh my god, like that game looks, it's like so far ahead of everything I have ever seen on the Super Nintendo. So that was crazy. And I mean, and then they would announce that, yeah, I mean, it's a Super Nintendo game. And like, I honestly like couldn't believe it. It was just, I don't know, like that was a next generation game on a, you know, old generation console.
Yeah, and we cannot discount how much of an effect it had on the console wars. This was kind of Nintendo's Weapon X, you know, that they launched against Sega, and they wanted to make sure that gamers knew that they had something that was very advanced, even though when you look back on it now, it's a lot of clever technical trickery. It really wasn't actual 3D modeling, but the illusion worked. The illusion of actual 3D worked, and they made sure to blast out a campaign of marketing against Sega and saying this is not available on Sega. These types of graphics are not available on Sega. You're not going to get them there. You know, one of the commercials said, you're not going to get this on the Genesis. You're not going to get this on the 32X. You're not going to get this on CD-ROM. You know where it is? It's on Super Nintendo. So this had a huge effect on the console wars of the 90s, the mush, tragic console wars of the 1990s where so many were lost in battle. So I really do think that it gained that prominence for being very graphically advanced, and people were just flabbergasted that a game like this could be achieved on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't, you know, looking at it now, it, you know, it looks a lot more dated, but still holds that, you know, of the games of this era who tried something outside the realm of, you know, pixel graphics, pixel art, it's probably one of the best that holds up, in my opinion. It's one of the ones that looks the least dated, though obviously with the advent of hindsight, with the advantage of hindsight, you could definitely see, you know, that it wasn't as impressive as we thought at the time. But, you know, for the time that it was released, this was next gen stuff. This was, you know, something out of science fiction, for me at least.
Well, and for a character like Donkey Kong, which has been around since 1979, you know, they really did a good job in bringing it to the times. And this was the 1990s where everything had to have attitude and everything was extreme. And they redesigned the image of Donkey Kong from kind of a very goofy looking character. If you actually look at Mario Kart, Super Mario Kart, you could see the old design, and it's kind of very goofy looking. It kind of looks like, I mean, I think Donkey Kong Jr. is the one they use in Mario Kart, but, you know, they redesigned it into this kind of like more cool and hip character that was better able to kind of fall into the times, and it was part of the Play It Loud marketing era of Nintendo, which was a direct response to the, you know, Genesis does what Nintendo don't, you know, marketing campaign that Sega launched. And so they really transformed Donkey Kong's image for a new generation.
And I think, you know, to follow up on what you're saying, he does fit into that generation. But I think one of the smart things they did was they made his design so simple and so, you know, sort of, I don't want to say elegant necessarily, but it's very much something that could be carried through to today. And I mean, we see the same design today. He's not Funky Kong. He's not, you know, he's not wearing a backwards hat and like some like 90s colored board shorts and like a tank top. Like he just has a tie. So it fit in that era and it seamlessly transitions to today without seeming dated.
They didn't give him backward pants like crisscross.
Yeah, exactly.
Or, like a tipped hat or sunglasses, even though the marketing campaign actually had a little bit of that, actually.
Yeah.
So that it wasn't completely out of the woods. Just to say, take a step back and talk a few about a few facts that about the game. It was released on November 21, 1994, and there were 12 developers working on it over an 18-month development period. And eventually, according to the interviews, 20 people eventually worked on it. It was directed by Rareware founders, and we're just going to call him Rare now, Chris and Tim Stamper. And the designer was actually this guy by the name of Greg Mayles, who actually is still with Rare and was most recently the creative director for Sea of Thieves, which was the most recent Rare games to come out. It was the first Donkey Kong game not produced or directed by creator Shigeru Miyamoto. And the game was actually green-lighted because, as we said, Rare was working with this SGI workstations, and they were doing some really impressive technical stuff. And they were working on this boxing tech demo. And Nintendo actually flew Genjo Takeda, who was one of their main hardware guys. He's actually the director of Punch-Out. And they flew him out to England to see what they were working on. And they were very impressed with what they saw. And so they asked them, what do you want to work on? And Chris and Tim Stamper said, we really want to work on Donkey Kong. And so they got the approval from the big boss, and that's all she wrote. So they were able to start working on it. And even though Shigeru Miyamoto, oversaw some of the production, and there was a little bit of a push on the new look. Nintendo is very protective of its characters, so there was some push back and forth with Japan about how much they could alter Donkey Kong's look. Actually, there's kind of a myth out there, or a rumor, that Shigeru Miyamoto was very competitive about the fact that these Westerners were taking a character of his, and it was perceived as a better game than what Nintendo was producing. And as the myth goes, or as the rumor goes, Yoshi's Island was actually kind of a response to Donkey Kong Country and the technical advances of Donkey Kong Country. So that's very interesting.
I mean, I think it's worth mentioning that, and I could be wrong, I have no information to verify this, but Donkey Kong Country definitely seems like one of, if not the first time, that Nintendo sort of allowed a non-Japanese development studio to work with, one of their most iconic characters at the time. I mean, Donkey Kong is, along with Mario, one of the original Shigeru Miyamoto creations. And the fact that they were okay with giving over one of their characters, albeit one that they did not use as much as other characters, over to Rare, I think says a lot. I think that Nintendo's always been known for being very, very protective of their IPs and very stingy. So the fact that they felt comfortable enough letting Rare make a game like this, where they're sort of creating the lore, they're sort of setting the stage for what Donkey Kong was going to be moving forward, what I think is a really big deal, and something that shouldn't, be overlooked very easily.
Well, I think to this day, Nintendo does outsource a lot of their games nowadays. I mean, much more so than they did in the 80s and 90s. I would have to agree with you that, yes, I think this was the first time that they ever gave the reins of development to another studio, a Western studio, more importantly. So, yeah, I still think that, I mean, imagine if in the 90s they had given over Zelda to a Western. Actually, now that I mentioned
About that.
oh God,
Yeah.
oh,
Was
But
it Oracle
let's not talk about those three games.
oh
Let's just pretend that
God.
they don't exist.
For those that don't know what we're talking about the
No, no, no,
Panasonic
no.
3D.
No, it's the Philips CDI.
Philips
Not the
CDI,
Panasonic
Philips
3DO.
CDI,
Philips CDI. Wanda Gamelon, Adventure of Link.
All right, let them rest in peace. Let them rest in peace. Actually, they're not in peace, but whatever. Just let them rest. Masa, I mean, can you guys tell me what is Donkey Kong Country for those that have been living under a rock, or those new listeners that did not grow up with it, or that are young listeners? What is Donkey Kong Country? Define Donkey Kong Country.
Well, before we get to that, I gotta mention something that I find really interesting. When you mentioned that only 12 developers worked on the game, and then around 20 people eventually worked on it. Isn't that really insane? Because just the other day I was reading about the development of Red Dead Redemption 2, and in the report it says that Rockstar has over 1,000 people working on that game. Okay, so yeah, sure, I understand that it's a huge, 3D open world game, but yeah, if you think about the technology of Donkey Kong Country, and how it's really cutting edge, it's insane to think that so few people actually worked on that game.
Oh, it's absolutely massive. And the thing is that nowadays, if you're a developer, you are the designated guy that models trees, or you are the designated guy that models benches, or that codes the artificial intelligence for the horse. You just do one thing. You specialize.
Yeah.
Whereas back in the 80s and the 90s, I mean, it was not uncommon for the composer to be coding, for the composer to be modeling, or for the director to be actually doing the coding. The teams did everything, and really it was a very versatile set of individuals. But if you really think about it, 20 people working on Donkey Kong Country for the time, that's actually quite a bit. When you think about it, a lot of the games that came out at the time were done by teams of maybe 6 to 10. A lot of the beat 'em ups that we know and love were actually done by just a few people, just a handful of people. But it's kind of indicative of how game development has blown up, and the fact that we just have this massive budgets, and the fact that it was done in 18 months. I mean, that's a it's a long time for the time period, but it's a short time in hindsight. So I really do think that you can't really discount, how much, we have evolved and how far we have come. So, guys, define Donkey Kong Country. Tell me what Donkey Kong Country is about.
First of all, it's not Mario.
With that out of the way.
Yeah, I would say, okay, so, okay, to Nintendo's credit, they have a few 2D platforming franchises, and they are all very different compared to each other. Like Mario, Yoshi, Kirby, Donkey Kong, they all play very differently. And Donkey Kong, I was actually replaying the game for the first time in years yesterday, and it actually shocked me how difficult it was. I had totally forgotten about, people always say that, yeah, I mean, Donkey Kong Country games, they are quite challenging, the recent ones as well. But I was playing the first and the second worlds, and I was like, oh my god, some of these levels are way more difficult than, let's say, almost any level in Super Mario World.
Yeah, they're hard as hell. I mean,
yeah, they are. Yeah,
those minecart levels are
oh my god,
super tough. So
I must have the first minecart level in Donkey Kong Country. I must have died, I don't know, 20 to 30 times yesterday, and I actually had to start abusing the save state function of the Super Nintendo Mini Classic to beat that level, and I'm not very proud of that.
Well, I mean, it's a good thing that you can rewind, because honestly, it takes such pixel perfect platforming. And just, I guess, to explain a little bit more, so Donkey Kong Country takes place across various settings, various levels. The first one takes place in kind of a jungle setting mostly, but also has forest settings like factory settings and the like. And Donkey Kong is one of the main playable characters. The other playable character is Diddy Kong. Donkey Kong is the heavy of the group. He plays a little bit more slower, a little bit more cumbersome, but it's a little bit easier to tackle enemies with him. Whereas Diddy Kong is a little bit more limber. He's a little bit harder to control, but since he's smaller, you can actually get by enemies a whole lot quicker. And there are also, you get these animal helpers in these settings, in a few of the settings. So, for example, there's an ostrich.
The rhino.
There's an ostrich or a rhino. Swordfish. Yeah, or a swordfish. And they kind of change the gameplay up a little bit. There's a focus on collecting a few things. You can collect like Kong. There are these letters scattered about. So there's a little bit of a focus on collecting. There really isn't a story, Donkey Kong, is supposed to relieve Diddy Kong, who is watching the banana hoard, and he forgets, he falls asleep, and then all of a sudden, they wake up and they don't have any more bananas because they were stolen by King k.rool, and they have to get their bananas back. That's it. That's the story. So there really isn't a focus on the story. It's really about the platforming, guys. So I actually, to be honest, I think it's good platforming. As you said, Masa, it's not Mario, but I think they're good platforming games. And they have enough variety that they don't necessarily feel old. What do you think, Arnie?
One of the things that I always think about when I think of Donkey Kong is, the art. I mean, and you could tell that this game was expensive to make, and they really cared about the art that went into it, because it has one of the cleanest UIs I've ever seen. Anything you collect shows up for a second in the top just to show you how much of whatever it is you have, and then it disappears. There's no live counter. There is a lives counter, but it's not there all the time. There's no health bars. There's no, any sort of indicators. It's just blank. So you can enjoy every single piece of, these crafted levels that they've made for you. And that's something I really did appreciate playing through the game. I played through it a little bit yesterday. And it's just a beautiful game to look at. I mean, it's just the environments are so well crafted. And the fact that they take you through sort of very different environments. In each of the games, there's like water levels, snow levels, jungle levels, all this sort of stuff just gives them a chance to sort of explore their, their color palette and their different assets that they have to make all these crazy levels. That, and obviously the music is amazing. The use of, you get to use both Kongs at the same time and switch between them freely, which to me was, I want to say something brand new. I don't think I'd ever played a game that let you do that.
They didn't play Sonic Chaotix or Knuckles Chaotix?
Unfortunately, no. But I think in that one, you're like holding a ring and you're like rubber banding together or something.
Terrible.
So that's not exactly what I'm talking about. But even in for example, Sonic's a good example. You have Tails as a follower, but you can't actively switch between yourself and Tails. Or other games like other beat 'em ups, when you have multiple characters, you only have one character on screen at a time, and if you want to play as the other character, you sort of switch out and do it that way. But this game, you have both characters on screen at the same time, and they're a visual representation of your health, because each Kong takes one hit, and if you lose both Kongs, then you lose a life. I always thought that was brilliant. Instead of having a couple hearts on top or a health bar, it's just a visual representation. And having both of the Kongs on screen at the same time, at least for me, makes it a little more impactful when I lose a life. It makes it so I'm a little more stressed, a little more on edge when I'm playing because I'm trying not to get hit.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned a very good point, which is that they wanted the UI to look clean. They really wanted this to be just a graphical showcase. And if you really think about it, the graphics, they're almost like a diorama. It's almost like a model. and it's photorealistic in that sense of like looking at a model. And you make that good point, which is that the UI disappears immediately. So it's really meant to be a graphical showcase, which is interesting because when I first became aware of Donkey Kong Country wasn't through Donkey Kong Country on the SNES. I actually first played it as Donkey Kong Land on the original Game Boy. So the graphical showcase for me was not really a part of it at all. You know, for me, it was just about the gameplay because, I think that for a Game Boy game, they look good. I'm not one of those persons that says, oh, they look like crap. I actually think they look fairly good, and the music actually translates very well to the Game Boy. But for me, gameplay was really what was important rather than the graphical showcase. It was only later that I actually became aware of Donkey Kong Country on the actual SNES. So I think, if anything, that's a testament to the gameplay and the fact that I enjoyed it so much at the time. And let me just say, it's kind of an overworld. You go through levels and it's you have kind of like an overworld setting. So it does feel like a journey of sorts.
Yeah,
so,
that's what I actually noticed yesterday when I was playing, and I really like the natural progression that you have like throughout these worlds. Like each level kind of is like a continuation of the previous one. And each world, like, you have a certain theme. I mean, of course, you might have a water level which is fairly different compared to the other levels. Let's say, like, the game starts with a jungle stage, and then the next one is also a jungle stage, but it's like dark, and I think it was raining. So it really makes a they like Rare did a really great job at like world building and creating all these environments. And even though a lot of these stages are sort of similar, but it feels like they are changing a little bit all the time. And then, of course, you make it to the next world, and there's a different kind of theme for the next stages that you will play.
Yeah, there's a natural sense of progression, and I think that's a very good thing that the game does, and particularly if you're a kid, experiencing this at the time, the fact that it feels like a real adventure and that you're exploring all these different settings and, what comes next. Now you're in like this, underwater level and you're playing with a swordfish. It really does have an element of surprise that I really appreciated at the time. I loved it. Even as Donkey Kong Land, I love the gameplay, and it was one of my favorite games, actually.
Also, what have to say is that what I really like about Donkey Kong Country is that, okay, as opposed to Mario games, like Mario games often aren't, okay, so if we disregard the 3D entries, but they often aren't about exploration. It's more about, like, even if there are secrets, it's more about just, making it to the end of the level as fast as possible. But in Donkey Kong Country, it really actually encourages you to explore the levels as they are. Like, you don't have a time limit, and these levels are all like so full of like all kinds of secrets.
Yeah, there are hidden secrets everywhere. Particularly if you have an animal, having the animal might lead you to another secret. And you mentioned what I was going to mention, which is that there is no timer, unlike Mario, and you really can take as much time as you want on each level. And I think that really makes for a more leisure, even though I wouldn't say relaxing play, because you're gonna be biting your nails off or tearing your hair out. But Arnie, you mentioned the music, and it's interesting that for the time the graphics were really what people loved about the game, but really now in hindsight, it's the music that really stands out. So
yeah,
tell me a little bit about the music.
I mean, I'm going to save you some time because this conversation, for me, begins and ends with Aquatic Ambiance.
Oh, yeah.
The best song of any of the games. I don't care what anybody says.
Well,
it's my favorite song. I remember when I was a kid and listening to it. Again, much like the graphics, that was something that I'd never heard anything like that before. It was beyond the bleeps and bloops of earlier games that I played. Not to say that, other video game soundtracks on the SNES weren't as good as this, but for some reason that song just resonated with me a lot, and I think it sort of carries through to the rest of the songs on this soundtrack, and I think the other games as well, is that the music seems to sort of, it's very much a part of the level.
Yeah,
it
absolutely.
fits in with the environment and the theme of the level. The snow levels music is very much like, I could listen to this and it reminds me of snow and being in the snow and playing in the snow. The like jungle level music is very much upbeat and more tropical feeling. The water level music gives me the feeling of being underwater. It's, I don't know that there's a word that I can think of to describe it accurately, but it just seems like it organically fits with the levels.
It's very thematic. It's very moody. Aquatic ambience, especially, is very ethereal. It does really feel like almost muffled, or almost like a siren is playing this. A siren is playing you this song underwater. It's something that you haven't really heard in any other SNES games. If you think about SNES soundtracks, a lot of it is kind of like that rock, annoying, riffy guitar sound.
Even if you think about like earlier Rare games, like Battletoads is a great example of that. It's like nothing but like guitar riffs and stuff.
Yeah, and look, they were okay. I mean, I'm not going to put them down. But the thing with Donkey Kong Country is that David Wise in particular, who was the primary composer for the soundtrack, but the soundtrack also had contributions by Evelyn Fisher and Robin Binland. All these guys were in-house Square composers, Rare composers. And he uses very original samples. And that's something that you see across the 3 Donkey Kong Country games. These are samples that you don't hear in any other SNES games. They're very much particular and recorded just for the Donkey Kong Country game. So they have a very particular identity. They have a very particular sound. And one of the things you mentioned, Arnie, is that they all differ from level to level. Just like there is variety in the levels, there is variety in the songs themselves. And some of them are very industrial based, and they have like a lot of factory sounds. Some of them have very progressive, kind of characteristics. Aquatic ambience is great. I'm a big fan of video game music, and Aquatic ambience is one of the greatest video game songs ever made. And it really stands out. One of the things that when you go back to the first Donkey Kong Country game is that there aren't as many memorable songs as you probably remember. I would say Simian Segway, which is the first song that plays, which is a very funky, jazzy song with a little bit of like jungle kind of theme, with like the percussion, and the bass sound. Fear Factory is also another good one that sounds very ominous, and it takes place, during the factory levels and the like, which are very, very hard. And Gangplank Galleon, which is the one that plays in the final boss, which it goes from like a very slow, kind of antiquated sound into like this very fast-paced, very catchy, almost poppy sound. So they're very different, and it's a phenomenal soundtrack.
Yeah, and I will say, sorry, Masa, just this quick point is, I think one of the other things that I really like about the Donkey Kong music in particular, and just listening it back to it again today, is that, and I know a lot of people say this about a bunch of different soundtracks, but it doesn't sound like video game music. I think I could play Aquatic Ambiance to somebody who has no idea what Donkey Kong Country is, and they wouldn't immediately assume that it's video game music. I think you could make the argument that it just works as a piece of music on its own without being associated to a video game per se. And I like that. I like music that's not necessarily designed to sound like video game music in a video game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, like Ozzy mentioned that, a lot of these songs, they sound very different, but if you listen to the full soundtrack, like none of these songs actually, they don't sound like, despite the differences, they don't really sound out of place. It does kind of like sound like there's like some kind of a like certain sound or certain theme when it comes to all of these songs that they kind of sound like they are definitely like from the same soundtrack, even if like you have a song like Aquatic Ambience and you have like Jungle Groove, Fear Factory, which are all like really different, but then it all kind of like comes together.
I agree. I agree, and I think it was a very well made soundtrack. I have my thoughts about which one's the best soundtrack. I think there's no contest that Donkey Kong Country 2 has the best soundtrack, but I
Absolutely.
think the first one has great soundtrack. So just to wrap up, Donkey Kong Country 1, it was the third best selling game on the SNES, so it sold very well. It was very critically applauded. EGM gave it a 9.25. Game Informer gave it a 9.5. IGN, sang its praises. However, there has been recently a reassessment of Donkey Kong Country, and it's kind of been perceived as a mediocre game. Even there have been some rumors that Shigeru Miyamoto thinks that this was also a mediocre game. I mean, this has recently been quelled by him. He says he has a fondness for it, but there's still kind of the mystery. I don't agree with that reassessment. I actually think that it's a good game that stands on its own. I don't think it's mediocre. I think that the gameplay holds up. I think that they're not boring games. I think that they're very interesting to play. They have enough variety. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would say, okay, so yeah, like I mentioned, I played the first game for the first time in many years yesterday, and I was actually like really shocked about like how good the game still is. And okay, I'm not gonna say that yeah, it's the best platformer of all time, but it holds up really well, and it's definitely like one of the better Super Nintendo, or I mean, one of the better platformers of the 16-bit era. There's enough variety, and like we talked about the game, like it's very memorable, and the soundtrack, it's okay. So nowadays, maybe the graphics aren't like the main point anymore because we have went way beyond that style. But when it comes to music, it is true, like what Ozzy mentioned, that nowadays it's the soundtrack that we talk about more, but the level design, it is still very good. And okay, so there's some bullshit levels like the first minecart one. Like nowadays, they like when it comes to like modern 2D platformers, you often don't see games anymore where you have like sort of like trial and error kind of levels, and like but yeah, in some of these games, like older games, like Donkey Kong Country, like you basically have to play a level a few times if you actually want to beat it. Like it's unless you have like superhuman reflexes that I guess I don't have because I kept dying over and over again playing the first minecart stage. But overall, I mean, it is still a very good game.
What do you think,
Yeah,
Arnie?
I mean, like with any reassessment, I think there's always going to be sort of a change in perception of a game, especially one that was released this long ago. I think a lot of it probably comes from the fact that when it was initially released, it looked really good, sounded really good. Do I think it's mediocre? No. I think that it stands among the best platformers of the SNES era for sure. Obviously, I think the second game improved upon it, and we'll get to that. But I think a lot of the hype I think around this game came from the graphics and the sound, and so I think a lot of these scores might be slightly inflated. But to say that it's mediocre, I think is a strong word for this game. I think it's a good game.
talk about Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Conquest. And actually, it's not Diddy Kong's Quest. It's
That's
Diddy's
what I thought it was.
Conquest. So get it right. It was released in November 20, 1995. And, when you look at this, guys, don't you miss when games took just a year to develop?
Oh, for sure.
I mean, I don't even understand that concept.
Nowadays it takes 3 years to get a game. At most.
I mean, unless you're Assassin's Creed or you're Call of Duty or you're.
Yeah, but even then, you need to have like 3 studios just like churning this
exactly.
out.
Something of this scale coming out in a year is more than impressive.
Yeah. But this sequel is the most beloved of the Donkey Kong Country series, I would say, and I think a big part of it is Diddy Kong. I'm gonna admit, guys, I'm a big Diddy Kong fan. I love Diddy Kong. He's probably my favorite Nintendo character. Besides Samus, of course, who is my one and only, my waifu of sorts. But Diddy Kong, I love Diddy Kong and his kind of playful nature. So I think a big part of Donkey Kong Country 2's appeal is the fact that Diddy Kong finally takes the center stage and he takes the spotlight. It also introduces Dixie Kong as a playable character. Yeah. And it removes Donkey Kong because he has been kidnapped by his nemesis, King k.rool. And so Diddy and Dixie, the story goes, have to rescue Donkey Kong. So
yeah, I was going to say, not to interrupt you, but I was going to say it's interesting that you think that, at least for you, Diddy is the reason this is such a beloved sequel. Because for me, it's Dixie. Because I'd already played with Diddy before, but Dixie, I think, added such a new element as far as the way the character plays. It's much different from Donkey Kong. I think it's much closer to Diddy's playstyle. She's also light, fast, but she has that hover ability that's really nice, and it allowed them to add like more and different challenges to the game. So for me, at least, it's all about Dixie Kong.
So is Dixie your wife?
Dixie is not my waifu, but in the Donkey Kong canon, probably yes, Dixie is my waifu.
So I guess you touched upon it in part, Arnie, but why do you guys think this entry is perceived as the best game in the series, and why do you think it's better than the original?
One thing that's interesting is that much like when we had those original arcade games, you had Donkey Kong Jr., where it was about like Donkey Kong Jr. Trying to rescue Donkey Kong, and here it's sort of the same thing. Like you have Diddy Kong trying to rescue Donkey Kong. Okay, so yeah, this has nothing to do with like why the game is better, but it's interesting how they kind of like took that like really old story and had their own like take on it.
I mean, I'm gonna take this opportunity to mention Persona because it's the other game that we always talk about. But I think Donkey Kong Country 2 did the thing that really good sequels always do. It took what worked about the first game and it made it better. The things that it added were things that the previous game was lacking. It refined on what had already worked, while also, adding enough new things to make it feel like a new game. I think that Donkey Kong Country 2 took, the level design that we loved, the music that we loved, the characters that we loved, the play mechanics that we really enjoyed from the first one, and sort of expanded it, made it bigger, better, faster, stronger, all those good things. And it also took, some of the stuff that maybe some other people didn't like. For example, I was not a huge fan of playing as Donkey Kong on the original Donkey Kong Country. I always played as Diddy because Diddy's just, at least to me, always controlled better and was easier to go around with in these sort of sprawling, like climbing levels than Donkey Kong was. Donkey Kong always felt a little bit too heavy, a little bit too slow. And I think that's why Dixie, I think, works better for me because it's more similar to Diddy while also having some neat new features to play around with.
Yeah, let me kind of build upon that. You really hit the nail on the head. I think the addition of Dixie Kong was really a huge improvement, and her hovering ability really changes the game and the gameplay so much that I found myself playing as Dixie more often than not. And it's kind of a crutch for less skilled players because it kind of allows you to save like a bad jump or something Absolutely. Like that. And they're both very limber. So they both move very fast, not like Donkey Kong, who moved a little bit slower. So I think it really created a very different dynamic than the original Donkey Kong, where it played a little bit faster. And let's not be mistaken, this game is harder than the original one.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely. Yeah.
extremely tough. Confession time. I have never beat Donkey Kong Country 2.
Yeah, same
I've
here.
never beaten Donkey Kong Country 2 either.
I can't. It's been kind of my white whale for a long time. But I do think the addition of Dixie Kong, I think, really was the changing factor in this game. And it also has, I think there is one general rule, and the golden rule is that if you add pirates to anything, it's automatically better. So this was a very pirates themed, entry. And a lot of the songs are kind of like shanties, and they're really, really fun to play with. The animal bodies are also very interesting. So you have like a spider that jumps, really high, and you also have a snake, also jumps high, and I forgot what they do in particular. A parrot that flies, and you also have the rhino. Yeah,
Yep.
The rhino
Squawks
comes.
the parrot, Rambi the rhino. I think the difference between the spider and the snake, if I'm not mistaken, is that the spider can shoot webs to make into platforms, and the snake just jumps really high.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Makes the webs. That's
Yeah.
true.
And yeah, I think the parrot was already in the first game, but like it wasn't really like established yet. Like it didn't have its own like bonus stages, and like you couldn't collect like parrot like those what do you call them, like those golden like parrot logos or whatever.
Like the bonus barrels or whatever they're called.
Yeah.
But like here, they made the parrot like a real character.
Well, I think also, Donkey Kong, the original, had very good settings, but very traditional settings. There was kind of the jungle level, the underwater level. I guess the factory level was pretty original, but Donkey Kong Country 2 has very, very out there levels. Like, one of them is like a theme park level. And so you play in a roller coaster, and there's like a lava level, and you play like, the platforming is through air balloons, which it's incredibly tough. I can't even stress how tough this is. But it presented a lot of variety in gameplay. So I think as a whole, it was just a tighter, even though it did more of the same, and it was kind of a, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It did it in such a better way, and the level design was a little bit tighter. The levels just, had better progression. There were better checkpoints and the like. And even though it was very hard, it still was very enjoyable to play.
I will say that one of the things that I also think was really interesting about this game is Rare had been given the reins of one of Nintendo's, I want to say, most storied, not necessarily beloved characters, but definitely one of their first and one of their most important characters. And to make a sequel that then sort of puts that character aside and puts their original characters front and center, I think was really brave of them, in the sense that clearly there had been love for the first game and people clearly like Diddy Kong, but I don't know that I would have, my immediate thought upon the success of my first game would have been to make a sequel where I remove the title character from the majority of the game. It's called Donkey Kong Country, but Donkey Kong is barely in it. I think that was a really brave move on their part, that they were confident enough in their own characters to sort of hold that game together, and is now the most well-regarded of the three.
And yeah, it's interesting how this is only the second game of the series. Like, you would expect something like that to happen if this was like, let's say, Donkey Kong Country 4 or whatever.
Exactly. Like,
then like at that point you could like remove Donkey Kong, but it was only the second game, and like you mentioned, it is Donkey Kong Country, and like the main character doesn't even like barely appears in the game. So yeah, it was quite
like, that's
interesting.
the thing, is like, it's not like Diddy Kong had a rich history of video games that people were like super familiar with. Like, the last game was the first time Diddy Kong had ever been in anything, and so to go from that to now you get your own game, I thought was I mean, it worked out and it's a great game, but I thought that was really a brave decision on their part.
Yeah, it's a little bit brazen, really.
Yeah,
And it's funny that for a series that's called Donkey Kong Country, the original trilogy, you only play as Donkey Kong in one of the games.
that's right.
So, how about the soundtrack, though, guys? I mean, can we talk
Oh
about the
my
soundtrack?
god.
I'm sorry, I don't think that Aquatic Ambiance is on the soundtrack. So
Oh, come on. Just the fact that Sticker Brush Symphony is in it, already invalidates that statement.
that was a really good song.
Yeah, but yeah, what's really interesting about the soundtrack is that, I would say there's even more variety this time around. You have a song like Disco Train, and like that doesn't remind me of Donkey Kong Country, like the first game. It actually I was like, hey, this kind of sounds like something that could have been in Streets of Rage. And then you have songs like Bossa Nova, and Forest Interlude, and those gave me like Square RPG vibes.
Yeah, they're very different. And like Disco Train, for example, the things that, by the way, David Wise was the sole composer on this one, so he really had the full command of the soundtrack. But Disco Train kind of goes up in this dynamic since it's the one that plays when you're on the roller coaster. So the song kind of goes up and down constantly, as if you're part of this roller coaster. So David Wise really captured the feeling of each level very well, and he did that in the original one. But in this one, it's even better. The way that he captures this soundtracks and the feel of the level itself. Well, and the thing also about the soundtrack, it's very complex. If you listen to the soundtrack, the instrumentation itself is super complex. So something like Hothead Bop starts out very simple, with kind of like a percussion mechanism, and then it goes into a melody. It's very melody oriented, and it contains a lot of catchy hooks. So let me ask you, which one's your favorite track?
If I had to pick one, it's either Sticker Brush Symphony or Bossa Nova, probably.
I think I would have to go with Sticker Brush Symphony.
Well, I don't think that we can disagree on Sticker Brush Symphony. I mean, I would say it's probably up there as top 3 SNES songs of all time, or even one of the top game songs of all time. And it's interesting because it plays in one of the hardest freaking levels ever made. So there's this beautiful.
That's why it's so good, because you had to listen to it over and over and
like
over again.
Playing that level over and over again, so it's good that the song is like really good.
That's why everybody loves it, because you know it.
Well, I have to give a shout out to a few other tracks that are pretty good. I love Hothead Bop. I mean, it has a very, very weird rhythm, and it has a very weird kind of time signature. Mining Melancholy is also a very good one. Snaky Shanty is just a fun track. And if you haven't seen, go to YouTube, and there's this guy that does kazoo renditions of video game songs. And there's a rendition of Snaky Shanty on a kazoo, and it's very, very fun. So you should listen to that one. In a Snowbound Land is also a very good one. And like you said, Arnie, it really does capture the feel of winter. So
See, it was funny because I was listening to In a Snowbound Land this morning, and then I listened to Northern Hemispheres, which is the snow song from the first game. And I like Northern Hemispheres a lot more than Snowbound Land. Snowbound Land's a good song, but Northern Hemispheres, I think, is probably the best snow song of the original trilogy.
Well, Northern Hemisphere is actually from the third game.
Oh, it's from the third game.
Yes,
sorry.
From the third game. And Northern Hemisphere is great, but we're going to talk about that later. But, moving on from the soundtrack, which I would be able to talk about all day long, this game sold very well. It sold 4.37 million copies. It was even better reviewed than the last game. It was named Best SNES Game of 1995 by GamePro, if you guys remember that magazine. Game Informer gave it a 9.75. It was very beloved. I don't think that even the Donkey Kong Country haters, I don't even think they can hate on this game, to be honest. I think this game is just beloved. There's just no way that you can hate on this game.
No, that's what the third game is for.
But yeah, it's a shame that Nintendo actually didn't include Donkey Kong Country 2 on the Super Nintendo Mini Classic, because I mean, of course it makes sense to have the first game, but I think that they also should have had the second game, which is, I mean, it is the superior game out of those two.
Yeah,
Here's the thing, is I agree with you that Donkey Kong Country 2 should have been on the Super Nintendo Classic, and I think that they lost the ability to make the argument that it makes more sense to have the first one when they included Final Fantasy 3 instead of Final Fantasy 2.
Well, I don't know if it necessarily follows. I mean, because Final Fantasy 3 and Final Fantasy 2, they're part of the same series, but they're self-contained games.
Whereas they are, but I mean, are we really going to say that the story of Donkey Kong Country 1 is so essential to the understanding of the greater Donkey Kong Country lore that we couldn't have had Donkey Kong Country 2 instead?
You have to follow the canon.
But yeah, maybe it is about the whole name thing, because I mean, it is Donkey Kong Country, and it's the only game where you really get to play as Donkey Kong.
You actually
Kong,
play as
so
Donkey Kong.
Like, yeah, here's a Donkey Kong game, but you know,
that argument I follow more than
much like Chrono Trigger. I don't care which game you had to take out, but this game had to be included. Donkey Kong Country 2 had to be included. And if you wanted to take out the first one, take out the first one. If you wanted to take out Kirby's Dream Course, please take out Kirby's Dream Course. But this game had to be included. There's just absolutely no excuse for not including this one. Just like Chrono Trigger. Those were the two big misses for what was otherwise a pretty great lineup. I guess, guys, we're gonna have to talk about the elephant in the room. Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. Yeah, I don't think this game is beloved, contrary to Donkey Kong Country 2. This is like the complete opposite of that. Pretty much the most hated, of the Donkey Kong Country games, unfortunately. And I don't think that's fair, but I'm gonna get into it later on. It was a very late release for the SNES. It was actually released in November 22, 1996, which is actually only 2 years since the release of Donkey Kong Country, the first one. So you could say that there was some Kong fatigue at this point. And by this point, you had the Nintendo 64 coming into the fore. The PlayStation was already a mainstay of the time. So the SNES was kind of all new. So it's not surprising that this game really didn't do that well. Dixie Kong returns. She is a playable character. And yeah, unfortunately, Kiddy Kong is the other playable character. And he's kind of the punching bag for this game. He's the one that everyone points to when they say, why did Donkey Kong Country 3 fail? They talk about Kiddy Kong. And their mission is the same as the previous game. They just gotta rescue Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong. And it's set in the Northern Hemisphere, which is kind of based off Northern Europe. So it's an interesting setting, but did you guys play Donkey Kong Country 3 in its original release?
Nope.
Yeah, I've never played Donkey Kong Country 3. Completely unrelated to this recording. I had been watching a playthrough of Donkey Kong Country 3 on YouTube, and I gotta say that Donkey Kong Country 3 seems like a pretty good Donkey Kong Country game, to be completely honest. I think the two big problems are obviously people don't like Kiddy Kong's design, and I agree. It's terrible. I don't like it. Kind of freaks me out. But I think the real issue, and this is coming from somebody having not played the game, I think the real issue is that people really liked playing as Dixie and Diddy because they were both sort of fast-moving, very easy to play, easy to maneuver characters. And I think Kiddy Kong is more of a Donkey Kong playing character. I think he's heavy, he's slow, he sort of doesn't move as well as Dixie Kong does. And so I think that a lot of people, it was one of those cases of you don't know what you have until it's gone. You didn't really realize how much you liked playing as Dixie and Diddy until you had to play as Kiddy Kong.
Have you played Donkey Kong Country 3, Masa?
No, I haven't, and it's mainly because, like you mentioned, the whole franchise fatigue, and yeah, I mean that's definitely what happened to me. I felt like 3 games in 2 years was just too much, and at that point, I was just waiting for the N64, and also like like yeah, like shamefully had to admit that I did not I wasn't able to beat Donkey Kong Country 2, so I think that was a big factor why wasn't like that interested in the third game. Although I have to mention that now that that Ozzy mentioned that it's actually like based off the world is based off the like Northern Europe. I'm like, yeah, I mean, I live there, so maybe I should check out the game after all.
I really think it's unfortunate because I think the reputation of this game precedes it, and I think people don't give it a fair shake, the fair shake that it deserves by playing it. And I have played it, and I actually really enjoy this game. And it's my second favorite, actually, over the original. And I don't think that the reputation as the weakest in the series is really warranted. I agree with your points, Arnie, about Kitty Kong. I think people were really put off by that. But I think overall, it's a very solid game. Another reason why I don't think the game really did as well is because the soundtrack was so different. And we'll talk about the soundtrack a little bit more at length. But I think ultimately the game plays very well. It's tight. There are some levels that I could do without. There is this new character called Ellie the Elephant. And it's a very, very terrible character because the problem is the elephant, is scared of mice, and there are a bunch of mice in the level. So whenever she sees a mouse, she like runs back. So you lose control of the character, and it takes control out of you. Whenever you take control out of the hands of the player, you've done something wrong. You shouldn't do that. And so they're very frustrating levels. So I think that's probably one of the biggest gripes I have with the game. I think, people talk about the level design, that the level design is not as interesting. I could see where they're coming from, but that didn't affect my enjoyment of it. I still thought that the levels had enough, up, down, and varying levels of movement that I found them interesting. But I really do think that it's a good game. I don't think it's a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. And I really love the aesthetic design of the game. Like I said, Masa, it's based off Northern Europe, so it's a colder environment, and it has more of like a forest setting. So it's more like like Northern Europe. I'm getting repetitive at this point. So I really do think that it's a good game, and if you guys are able to play it, give it a go because I really do think that it's a good game.
Yeah, it happens to be the only Donkey Kong Country like home console game that I don't own. I have the first game, the second game, and then also the Wii game, and of course Tropical Freeze on the Wii U. But that game I don't even own.
Yeah, I mean, and look, you can get it on the GBA, you can get it on the original Game Boy, and of course it's not going to be the same thing, but it's also been released on the 3DS, I think, if I recall correctly. So you can play it, but it's actually, if I recall correctly, it was one of the original SNES games that I saw when I was in Cuba, and I remember looking at it, and I think this was the actual first game that I saw from the Donkey Kong Country series playing on the SNES and not on the Game Boy. So it really was, when I saw it, an amazing looking game. So for me, it kind of went completely backwards. So I think it's a good game. I think you guys should play it.
Yeah, I mean, and it, just based on what I've seen of other people playing it, the scope of the game seems to be really interesting. The way you get around the map, having to, purchase new vehicles to sort of move to the different areas of the map, I thought was really cool. Just getting to see the characters, just having control of the characters moving around the overworld in not as linear a fashion as the other two games, I thought was really interesting. And I mean, the way, they've designed puzzles to sort of work around, because I think Kitty Kong can throw Dixie Kong and stuff like that. So they've designed it to work in different ways. The game seems interesting enough. I don't, it doesn't look as horrible as people would have you think it is.
It's not, and I will vehemently, argue against that. I think it's a good game. Actually, I actually think it's a good game. But like I said, one of the reasons why I think it didn't do well was because the soundtrack was so divisive, and I think that's actually kind of odd because the soundtrack was more ambiental. It lacked the melodies of Donkey Kong Country 2, so it didn't have the same sound as Donkey Kong Country 2, and I think that's what pissed people off. It's more of an eerie, moody sound, and it kind of evokes the wintry landscapes that the game takes place in. But if you really think about it, that's not very different from the original Donkey Kong Country. The original Donkey Kong Country was more ambiental in nature in terms of its music. And the music was composed by Evelyn Fisher with contributions by David Wise. So David Wise was not the primary composer, but he did contribute a lot to it. But I actually think that it's a terrific soundtrack that has actually grown on me a lot. Arnie, as you mentioned, Northern Hemisphere, that's a really, really good song. I love that song.
I really like that song, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, do you guys have a favorite track? And I know the answer to this.
No.
Exactly.
Because, to be honest, I don't think I've heard. I have not played the game. I haven't even watched any footage on the YouTube, so I'm a bit I have no idea.
Yeah, no, I mean, but there are some good tracks, and I love Northern Hemisphere, but there are other tracks like Brothers Bear, which is kind of a more bluegrass type, song. Frosty Frolics is a very eerie game, and it's soundtrack, and it's one of the best tracks I think in the Donkey Kong Country 2 oeuvre. But regardless of whether you think the soundtrack was any good at all, it has such a negative reputation that it was actually redone by David Wise when the game was released for the Game Boy Advance. And it's kind of interesting to see kind of an alternate history of what the soundtrack could have been. I think ultimately the soundtrack for the Game Boy Advance is not as good, and I think it suffers because the Game Boy Advance just did not have a good sound chip. But it's interesting to kind of see two soundtracks just have a take on the same themes. So have you guys played it for the GBA at all?
No.
No. I honestly, I knew that there was a remake for the Game Boy Advance, but that sort of left my mind a while ago. I was surprised to see it on this list.
Yeah, I mean, and it was a good remake. Yeah. I actually enjoyed it, and I actually played it last night, and it holds up. So,
and they remade the first two as well for the GBA, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
So they've come out basically, they came out on the Game Boy, and it was made on the Game Boy, and then it was remade on the Game Boy Advance. The original one came out for the Game Boy Color, but that's the only one that came out for the Game Boy Color.
That's right.
But I think if you guys have an hour to spare, check out the soundtrack even if you haven't played the game, because it's actually a really good soundtrack that kind of grows on you. The original SNES one. In terms of reception, I mean, the game was fairly well reviewed still. It received low 80s, mid 80s, but it wasn't a hit. It wasn't a hit, and it sold the least amount of copies, at least until Tropical Freeze was released. I also think, not to blame it on this, but the ad campaign for this game was not great. I don't know if you guys have seen any of this, but basically they try to make it into this attitude, tough mentality. So kind of like Donkey Kong's child is back, and he's a wild child. And so you see this, magazine ad of this gorilla with tattoos and piercings and stuff like that. And he's with his arms crossed, in front of graffiti. Everything that we laugh about in the 90s, that's really what it had. And then if you see the commercial, there's one commercial where it's basically a gorilla on a shopper, a motorcycle. And there's this woman, very sexy looking woman on this jukebox. And she's dancing. And when you get close to her and she turns her head, it's a monkey, and it's the head of a monkey on this very sexy woman. And it's just very creepy. Very, very creepy. Wow. So if I was at all interested in this game, if I saw that ad, I would have been that's it. I'm done. I'm not playing this.
No.
So
that is way too far afield from what Donkey Kong Country is.
Certainly. If you guys go to YouTube and check it out, because it's actually a very interesting, to say the least, ad. So I guess we can move on a little bit from the original trilogy, and we're not going to focus as much on the later games. But there weren't that many games that came after, funnily enough. Donkey Kong Country 64 came out in 1999, and that was released for the Nintendo 64, and it was a 3D platformer much in the vein of Super Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, was a collectathon platformer, so it was much more of an emphasis on collecting and the like. So, did you guys play this originally?
I did. I played a little bit of it. I never got too far into it. The collecting aspect of it just went way too far. The amount of characters that there were and the stuff that you had to do, it didn't grab me. It was less platforming, more just pure collectathon. And I just wasn't very interested in it. And it was also overshadowed by the best Donkey Kong Country on the N64, which was Diddy Kong Racing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Diddy Kong Racing is my jam.
It was good, and it was like arguably better than the Mario Kart 64.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the longest time, actually, like until Mario Kart 8, Diddy Kong Racing was my favorite racing game, or let's say at least like a kart racing game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So did you play this originally, Masa?
Actually, no. It might even be the only rare title on the N64 that I've never played, and I don't even know why. Maybe back then because they were putting out a lot of games. Like we got Jet Force Gemini, GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, Banjo-Kazooie, Blast Corps, you name it, like so many games, and I got most of them. And I guess it was just like too much on my wallet, so I never got Donkey Kong 64.
Well, that means you didn't have to listen to the DK rap. So
I was gonna say that was the best contribution of Donkey Kong 64, and I hope that you insert that rap somewhere in this episode because
it's being inserted right about now.
Here we go. Performance for you. If you know the words, you can join in too. Put your hands together if you want to clap as we take you through this monkey rap. He's the leader of the bunch. You know him well. He's finally back to kick some tail. His coconut gun can fire in spurts. If he shoots ya, it's gonna hurt. He's bigger, faster, and stronger too. He's the first member of the DK crew.
And also, it's true that Donkey Kong 64, like out of all the rare classics on the N64, that was like one of the not so like well received games. Like I thought that it got like worse reviews than, like, for example, Banjo-Kazooie.
It did.
Yeah.
And
I mean, Banjo-Kazooie did it so much better. Mostly, I think because it had, I think that it had more of a classic platformer feel to it, and it wasn't as much about, you got to think, and Ozzy, you might know better than me, but what were there 4, 5, 6 different characters?
There were 5.
Which you had to collect at least 5 different items for, because I think there were like colored bananas, there were coins, there were some sort of fruit or something like that. So each character you had to do like 2 or 3 different collectathons for to progress the game. It was too much.
Yeah, it was excessive collecting.
Yeah.
Too many characters. They all play differently. I think they just went overboard with it. And really, I think once Banjo-Kazooie came out, I think it overshadowed this game. It really did. And I think it's no surprise that the series was kind of put on the shelf after Donkey Kong Country 64. And we wouldn't see another mainline entry until 11 years later, which in game years, that's, centuries, really.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until Retro Studios, who are in Austin, Texas, and are better known for the Metroid Prime series, they started working on Donkey Kong Country around the late '80s, and they released Donkey Kong Country Returns in 2010 for the Wii. Did you guys play this one?
I did.
What do you guys think?
Yeah, I loved it. I thought it was really good. Hard as hell, though. I did not get very far in this game. But I really enjoyed playing it, especially on the Wii, because I thought that it was one of those Wii games that at the time I was like, this controls fairly well. I can deal with this.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing was that they kind of try to shoehorn those Wii controls onto it.
Yeah.
And it was really unfortunate. So I'm glad that they released it on the 3DS, because you don't have to deal with the motion controls.
Yeah, I would say like the game. Okay, so once again, I never beat it, and I think that the very first game of the series is the only Donkey Kong Country game that I've actually beaten. I would say Donkey Kong Country Returns, it's a fine game, but like I never really fell in love with it. Okay, so once again, I didn't really make it like that far into that game, but I don't know, like there was like something off with that. And when it comes to these like Retro Studios game, I absolutely prefer Tropical Freeze over it.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that one of the things that struck me with Donkey Kong Country Returns is that it was kind of not confident enough in itself, so I had to keep calling back to the older games and kind of keep doing things that the older game did or putting music that was in the older games in order to have that feel of nostalgia. So I don't think it was as confident a game as Tropical Freeze, which came out in 2014 for the Wii U, and it was also done by Retro. And let me tell you guys, I mean, it's a hard one to think about what my favorite Donkey Kong Country game is, because I think Tropical Freeze is probably up there as the best Donkey Kong Country game. I think it's absolutely amazing. So I don't know if you guys agree with that. I may be a controversial statement, but I think it's a fantastic, fantastic game.
I don't think there's anything controversial about that, and I would have to agree. Like Donkey Kong Country Returns, I would say the main issue with that game was that it almost felt like a remake of the very first game, and it was just more of the same. Okay, yeah, sure, there was this real long gap between these games, but yeah, Tropical Freeze, it's not only the best Donkey Kong Country game, but also one of the best 2D platformers that I've ever played. And I would say it's kind of had the same kind of an impact on me as the very first game, you know, back in the mid-90s. Like the level design, once again, it's outstanding. There's like so much variety, so many interesting stage gimmicks, and yeah, I mean, it is tough as hell.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, you know, the fact that David Wise returned for Tropical Freeze to do the soundtrack, it's my favorite soundtrack, actually. I mean, it's between that and Donkey Kong Country 2. But there's so much variety in the settings, you know. It's kind of like, you know, the Frozen setting, you know, coupled with the jungle theme. And you play as Diddy Kong, and Dixie Kong, and even Cranky Kong. And they all play kind of differently. So it's a lot more varied than the old Donkey Kong Country game. So I really do think that it's an evolution of the gameplay that we didn't necessarily see back in the 90s. So yeah. I do think that it's a fantastic game, and I guess this episode is topical because the re-release for the Switch just recently came out. So if you have any interest, I mean, this game sold very poorly on the Wii U, so please go out there and support the Switch release because it's a fantastic game, and it's really unfortunate that it was overlooked.
But yeah, it's great that it was released on the Switch because based on the sales data that we have gotten so far, it's actually doing better than the original game on the Wii U.
I haven't played Tropical Freeze, but I can already tell that it's one of the greatest because it's the triumphant return of my boo, Dixie Kong. So that in and of itself is probably reason alone to buy the game. But I've heard nothing but good things about it. So I definitely need to go check it out when I buy my Switch in 2027.
At some point. I mean, the fund is still active, guys. If you want to donate to Arnie's Switch fund, it's all for a good cause. He needs it to perform his job. So please go, you know, give him money. Yeah, sometime in 2021, we'll hear about Arnie having a Switch. We're going to have a special episode when that happens. But we're kind of running out of time, so let's wrap it up with what we usually like to do, which is a quick fire. Okay, Masa, Diddy Kong or Dixie Kong?
Diddy.
Dixie.
Favorite DKC game?
Tropical Freeze.
I gotta go with the original. I think the original is my favorite.
DK2. right, guys. I think that wraps it up for today, and I think this has been a really, really fun one. Unfortunately, our dear Canadian co-host and friend and colleague, compatriot, is not around. Paul is not with us, but make sure to visit him. You can find him at Paul's Game Room, Paul's_Game Room. Where can we find you guys? Masa.
You can find me on Instagram, and my handle is MasaJarvinen09.
Arnie?
You can find me on Instagram as well. It's welcome to the game. The word welcome, number 2, the game.
Great. My name is Ozzy, and you can find me at on Instagram at Shadow the Collector with periods in between all those words. You can also find our podcast at Region Free Gamers, just exactly like that. We're putting up a lot of original content, so make sure to give us a follow on Instagram. We're making sure that the Instagram page is constantly populated so that you have fresh content that you're not going to get anywhere else. Please subscribe. Please give us a review on iTunes. It would really help. We still have 0 reviews on iTunes, so please, we're begging you. Do it.
Yeah, reviews, comments on anything. Any podcast platform, YouTube, anything.
Yeah, anything you can do, that's all gonna help. Put the word out. If you like what you hear, put the word out. Tell your friends, tell your mom, tell your brother, anyone that would be interested in games. Just let them know that we're doing our thing. And with that, we are about to wrap it up. So thank you very much for listening, guys. This has been a great episode. This has been the Region Free Gamers podcast. So until next time, see you around.
See you guys.
Peace out.